I've claimed that our times are requiring new steps in our development as a species, an essential kind of growing up, using the language of creative systems theory, a new cultural maturity. I've also proposed that if the concept of cultural maturity is not basically correct, it's hard to be legitimately hopeful about the future. In the previous segment, I introduced the concept of cultural maturity by putting it in historical perspective. I described it as the next step in the evolution of narrative, a new kind of guiding story that has its roots in a newly possible depth of engagement in who we are as humans. In my various writings, I come at making sense of cultural maturity's changes in multiple further ways, touching on a few of the most important helps set the stage for reflections to come. Understanding cultural maturity in terms of changes in our relationship as individuals to our cultural context provides a good place to start. I referred to cultural maturity as a kind of cultural growing up. In times past, we have mythologized culture, treated it as a symbolic parent. Our times are challenging us to step beyond this kind of parent-child relationship. They demand that we leave behind past cultural absolutes, from clear gender roles to my country, right or wrong nationalism, to past absolutist moral dictates. In a whole new sense, cultural maturity's changes make us responsible not just for what we do, but for the truths we draw on, both individually and collectively. A second way to think about cultural maturity's changes turns to capabilities needed if we are to effectively make our way. In my various writings, I've described how today's essential challenges demand new skills and capacities, abilities that have not before been necessary or really possible. Beyond that greater responsibility, they've required that we learn to better tolerate uncertainty, complexity, change. They require, too, that we be more comfortable with the fact of real limits. They require that we more fully appreciate how truth always exists in a context, how what is true in one time and place may be very different from in another. And bringing these recognitions together, they require that we think more systemically, in ways that more consciously engage the whole of who we are, and in the process better address the whole of what we might wish to understand. In short, they require that we become more comfortable with just how big reality can be. A third way of thinking about cultural maturity's changes is implied in the terms I've used to describe it. We can think of it developmentally. Creative systems theory describes how we find essential parallels in how human developmental processes of all sorts work. The surprising recognition that for me resulted in the concept of cultural maturity concerns how today's challenges culturally parallel those that confront us with second half of life changes in individual development. The task in personal development then is to see things with a sense of perspective, depth, and proportion that has not before been an option. We get the reward that we might act not just intelligently, but sometimes wisely. The concept of cultural maturity describes how something related will be needed ultimately at a cultural scale if we are to have an ultimately positive future. The most powerful way to come at understanding cultural maturity focuses on the cognitive changes that produce it. Creative systems theory describes how each stage in any developmental process is organized cognitively in predictable ways. The mature stages offer that we might at once be able to better step back from and more deeply engage the whole of who we are in that particular process. With cultural maturity, we become better able to step back from and deeply engage the whole of who we are as human beings. We'll later come back for a closer look at this dynamic that creative systems theory calls integrative meta-perspective. For now, we can note that one result is the possibility of more complete and systemic, we could say more whole box of crayons, ways of understanding ourselves and the world around us. In particular, it helps us more consciously hold the multiple aspects that make up intelligence. In various segments, we'll see how cultural maturity's changes have essential consequences. I've described how they provide a new guiding story for a time. They also help us get beyond simple answer ideological conclusions. Later, we'll look at how ideology is the product of taking a single crayon in that systemic box and making it the whole of truth. They offer the possibility of more complete ways of holding identity and relationships of all sorts. We'll see how they redefine both leadership and love. And they invite us to craft more encompassing, more systemic ways of understanding more generally, ways of thinking that help bring the kind of nuance to understanding that questions of all sorts are increasingly requiring of us. Creative systems theory is one example of that kind of framework. The picture that results takes us back to that key theme that will tie the various episodes together. While cultural maturity makes major new demands of us, ultimately, it's common sense. Better drawing on the whole systemic box of crayons in this way is in the end only about better seeing what is in fact the case. What culturally mature perspective provides ultimately is a new, more complete kind of common sense. As always, I look forward to your thoughts and questions.